Chapter 15 of our behavioral neuroscience textbook, segment 1 included pages 467 to 476, and the chapter talked about emotions, aggression, and stress. So, just as a little introduction, the chapter talks about the brain mechanisms related to emotional states, specifically fear and aggression, and their significance to our survival, and lastly, stress and its involvement in the nervous and endocrine systems. The first section talks about emotions, and the text defines emotions as subjective mental states that are usually accompanied by distinctive behaviors as well as involuntary physiological changes. And emotions are typically experienced only briefly, but certain ones may be felt for longer periods of time. So there are a few broad theories of emotion, and these theories emphasize the bodily responses behind the emotion. So two major parts of the nervous system that we have to take into account are the sympathetic nervous system, which activates the fight or flight response, and is part of the autonomic nervous system that arises from the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. And the parasympathetic nervous system prepares the body to relax and recuperate, and it's the part of the nervous system that arises from cranial nerves and the sacral spinal cord. So these two parts of the nervous system have very close ties with emotional states. So do emotions cause bodily changes or vice versa? There are two major theories on this question. The first one being the James Lange theory. So these two researchers, James and Lange, proposed that emotions are caused by bodily changes and that different emotions feel different because they are generated by different constellations of physiological responses. And so this theory inspired attempts to link specific emotions to bodily responses, but there is no distinctive autonomic pattern for a specific emotion. The second theory is the Cannon-Bard theory, which states that the brain decides which particular emotion is an appropriate response to the stimuli. The cerebral cortex simultaneously decides on the appropriate emotional experience and activates the autonomic nervous system to prepare the body, using either the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. Another major kind of theory is the cognitive attribution model, proposed by Stanley Schachter, which is a cognitive interpretation of stimuli in visceral states. So the theory says that emotional labels are attributed to relatively non-specific feelings of physiological arousal, and which emotion we experience depends on the cognitive systems that assess the context. For example, our understanding of the current social, physical, and psychological situation that we are presently in at the time of the emotional experience. So an experiment was done to sort of explore this, and people were injected with adrenaline, and one group was told that there would be no effect, and the other group was told that their hearts would race, so the effects of adrenaline. And the group who was warned reported no emotional experience, but those that were told that there would be no effect reported emotions, so they were either angry or happy. This actually, interestingly, was affected by the Confederate. So if the Confederate was angry, the participant would be angry, but if the Confederate was happy, then the participant would be happy. And this displayed that emotional states result in interaction between physiological arousal and cognitive interpretation of that arousal. And another interesting outcome of the experiment was that people who received epinephrine experienced more intense emotions than those given saline. There were a few criticisms of this, though, a major one being that the positive and negative emotions involve different physiological responses, but within those categories, different emotions involve the same responses. And this is why the polygraph, which is a lie detector device that measures several bodily responses, such as heart rate and blood pressure, is considered a bad method of distinguishing liars from anxious innocents, because both liars and anxious innocents may have the same physiological responses, but we would label their responses as guilty. Box 15.1, which is entitled Lie Detector, kind of explains the polygraph a little bit more in depth and the procedure behind it. And so in a lie detector test, physiological measures are recorded in an attempt to detect lying during a carefully structured interview. This assumes people have emotional responses when lying, which are accompanied by bodily responses, respiratory rate, heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductance. And the changes are recorded as wiggly lines called traces, and so it tracks the physiological arousal over time. However, it's not a foolproof method, and it only has 65% accuracy. The next section talks about emotions from an evolutionary viewpoint. So it points to Charles Darwin's book, The Expressions of the Emotions in Man and Animals, from 1872. And in his book, he kind of points to evidence that certain expressions of emotions are universal among people of all regions of the world, and asked whether non-human animals show comparable expressions of some emotions, which leads researchers to the question, is there some sort of aspect of emotional expression from a common ancestor? He also emphasized that non-human primates have the same facial muscles that humans have, and, muscles that previous scholars thought were uniquely given to express emotions, uniquely given to humans to express emotions. And three major facial expressions that he points to is the grimace, the tense mouth, and the play face. One major question that arises from the evolutionary viewpoint of emotions is how may emotion and emotional displays have evolved over time. So the field of evolutionary psychology, which devotes itself to asking how natural selection has shaped behavior in humans and animals and other animals, this field of thought proposes that emotions are broad motivational programs that coordinate various responses to solve specific adaptive problems, i.e. maintaining cooperative relations with members of a group, choosing a mate, avoiding predators, and finding food sources. And so emotions may be seen as evolved reprogramming that helps us deal quickly and effectively with a wide variety of situations. Another major point from this field is that individuals differ in their emotional responsiveness. So the individual response stereotypy is the tendency of individuals to show the same response patterns, i.e. the emotional reactivity and the physiological responses behind that, to particular situations throughout their lifespans. So some longitudinal studies have tracked the emotional reactivity from early childhood into adulthood. They used stimuli to trigger autonomic responses and have found that response patterns remain consistent throughout life. And so many high reactives, meaning people who reacted strongly to the stimuli in these studies, were found to develop anxiety, or many have developed anxiety disorders and phobias later on in life. Another major question that the text proposes is, how many emotions do we experience? So there are theories that there are 8 basic emotions. There may be more, but many theories hold 8 responsible. And these 8 are grouped in 4 pairs of opposites, so joy and sadness, affection, disgust, anger, fear, and expectation, surprise. So facial expressions have complex functions in communication. Paul Ekman and his group of researchers proposed that there are distinctive expressions for anger, sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, surprise, contempt, and embarrassment. And expressions are interpreted similarly across cultures without explicit training, and facial expressions are not unfailingly universal. And so isolated non-literate groups did not agree with Westerners about recognizing expressions of surprise and disgust, for example. Cultures prescribe rules for facial expression and control and enforce rules by cultural conditioning. But what is still up for debate is the extent of the cultural influence over the facial display of emotion. And a final point that the text raises in this section is the researcher Fridlund, who proposed that a major role of facial expression is paralinguistic, meaning the face is accessory to verbal communication and provides direction in conversation.